what neuroscience tells us about making better decisions. And decisions are a really fascinating topic. I mean, it's just such a fundamental part of us, who we are, and it leads to different events in our lives that we may not always get a glimpse of how many decisions you make. I mean, and believe it or not, your brain made somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 decisions. Let that sink in. 35,000 to 40,000. You may not realize, maybe you think you made two or three decisions, but really it what your brain does in this situation is it takes all these different scenarios and thinks about what consequences it can make and then makes the decision based on that. A lot of it based on what you have done before and what kind of decisions you've made in similar situations like this. And you may not realize it, like where to look, whether to turn your camera on, how much attention this deserves. It deserves a lot of attention, I'll tell you that. This is going to be an interesting talk. And most of this, like I said, it happens without you even noticing. So here's a question that I want to open this talk with, and I want you to actually sit with for a second or two. If your brain is making that many decisions, how many of them are actually yours? Just think about that throughout this talk. So, who am I? My name is Amir Ali. I am an undergraduate neuroscience student at the University of Washington in Seattle, originally from Vancouver, Canada. I also run an initiative in how I move through my own life is how understanding the brain can genuinely change the way that we make choices, in life and um, in other areas. So, that's what today's talk is about. It's not a lecture, not a list of fun facts to memorize. I want to take you inside the actual messy fact and something that you can actually start to use today in your own life. So, oops, I'm having trouble changing tabs. Oh, there we go. Your brain is truly a decision machine. And by the end of your talk, you're going to understand what I mean by saying this. And making smart choices, no matter what it is. And that's not actually what's happening, and it's not even close to what is happening. Decision making in the brain, it's very distributed. There are multiple regions running in parallel, all with different priorities, all competing for influence. The prefrontal cortex, for instance, handles deliberate, goal-directed thinking, planning, consequences, the long game. And the amygdala is your threat detector and emotional alarm system. And it gets first mover advantage in almost every situation because that's evolved first before the prefrontal cortex and many other areas of your brain. The striatum manages habits and reward. It's the part that makes you reach for your phone before you've even registered that you're bored, and the anterior cingulate cortex essentially acts as a conflict monitor, lighting up when your instincts and your logic are pointing in opposite directions at the same time. So that's just some of the neuroanatomy, basic neuroanatomy, I have to say, underlying your decision-making process and thinking. So when you make a decision, you're not consulting one advisor. You're in a group chat where everyone is messaging all at once, and the loudest voice is almost never the most rational one. And that's what's tricky about decision making. So here's the core insight that everything else in this talk builds on. Your brain did not evolve to help you make good decisions. It evolved to help you survive. And those are not the same thing. A brain that's optimized for survival in an uncertain, dangerous environment doesn't actually very naturally produce careful, balanced, future-oriented choices. It produces fast, conservative, emotionally driven ones. And we're navigating modern lives with exams, careers, relationships, social media, with that exact same hardware. So you can see where there's sort of this mismatch between optimizing for survival and being driven by emotions over thinking rationally through every decision that you make. So I want to take you through these two distinct modes that your brain operates in and understand the difference between them to explain more of how your daily behavior, you know, influences the decisions that you make almost more than anything else. And the first mode is fast, automatic, and effortless. It's the part that reads emotion on someone's face in a fraction of a second, really. It's pattern recognition and it's intuition. It's what lets you navigate a familiar app without consciously thinking about where to tap, for instance, on your phone. This mode is always running in the background without you consciously realizing, constantly feeding you rapid fire assessments of everything that's going on in your environment. The second mode is slow and deliberate, and it's meta expensive. Your brain uses about a fifth, so 20% of your body's total energy, despite being only 2% of your mass. So it is extremely metabolically expensive, but for good reason. Deep analytical thinking is the most costly part of this, so your brain rations it aggressively. And here's what should make you stop for a second. The fast automatic mode is running the show nearly 95% of the time. The majority of what you consciously um, experience, reason decisions are actually your brain building a story after the fact to explain something that it had already decided before. And brain activity is, the ones that's associated with action. It begins hundreds of milliseconds before conscious awareness even catches up. So your awareness is often the narrator, not the author of it all. And once you know that stress, sleep deprivation, cognitive overload, and even just being really hungry all push you further into that fast automatic mode, you start to understand why decisions made in those conditions go wrong so predictably. You can't always avoid those states, but you can definitely try to design around them. Now let's talk about dopamine and what role it plays in all of this. Because I promise almost everything you've heard about it is missing the most interesting part. Popular culture, as you've probably seen through social media, has spent years calling it the pleasure chemical, the reward neurotransmitter, the reason things feel good. But that framing is incomplete. Dopamine is primarily a prediction signal. Your brain is constantly running modes of what's about to happen based on past experience. And when reality turns out better than expected, dopamine fires. On the other hand, when it turns out worse, dopamine drops. So when it turns out exactly as predicted, what happens? Nothing. Flatline. No dopamine produced. And there's also no drop in dopamine levels. So dopamine is about surprise in the direction of reward. And here is where it gets genuinely wild. The signal fires most strongly during anticipation, the moments just before you found out, um, something new about anything that it is. It could be like a new fact or a new way to feel something. And that uncertainty itself is what drives this entire dopamine system. It's the not knowing. And this is what media often doesn't tell you. This is why gambling, for instance, is so neurologically captivating. Unpredictable rewards generate far stronger dopamine responses that you don't see in consistent ones. Your brain essentially goes electric with uncertainty, and this is not a coincidence in how social media is designed. The hold to refresh gesture is structurally identical to a slot machine lever, if you think about it. So you don't know what you're going to find, and your dopamine system was built over, of course, millions of years of evolution to respond intensely to exactly that kind of setup. And this is why it's so easy to, spend 3 hours on your phone and feel completely empty afterward because the dopamine was in the reaching for it. In those first few seconds of novelty, once you're deep in and there's nothing new, the signal fades. You're not chasing pleasure anymore, you're chasing the prediction of it. Once you see the mechanism clearly, you start making very different choices about where you put your attention. Now, this is the question at the center of this entire talk. So let's actually answer it, or at least try. You know, the late night snack isn't what your future really wants. That's not your future self. That's not what your future self wants. You know that skipping the thing you said you do isn't serving your goals, the goals of tomorrow and the day after and years after even. You know that scrolling until 2 a.m. is going to cost you tomorrow, and you do it anyway. Isn't that strange? That's not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline. It's because your brain has several deeply wired tendencies that make this the path of least resistance. And that is what we have evolutionarily been designed to do, to take the most easy path, the one with the least amount of hurdles. And the first is present bias. The brain places dramatically more weights on immediate outcomes over future ones. That snack, it's right there, right? And your health, your emotional core alongside your rational planner. And when these two systems compete and collide, the emotional one has a significant structural advantage. Fortunately and unfortunately, it depends on the situation. The second is loss aversion. The pain of losing something is roughly twice as strong as the pleasure of gaining the equivalent thing. This is why you hold on to bad situations longer than you should, and you give up on good opportunities faster than is rational. Say something like if you want to continue to try to keep the business alive, even though it's bound to fail, and you're essentially wasting your time, trying to keep the business alive. Or with relationships, if you're in a toxic relationship, but you've been with the person for, let's say, a few years already, you don't want to let the relationship go, and you want to continue being with that person, even though the relationship is toxic, and the better thing to do is to end it, essentially. And that's kind of the idea of a sunk cost fallacy. Um, but it ties back to evolution again. The reason this happens is because your brain evolved to treat losses as disproportionate. Something, you know, instead of letting it go and losing it, um, is often the better thing to do because again, it ties back to how much investment and effort you've put into something, and you just don't want to lose that thing so bad that even if it's hurting you now, you still don't want to let it go just because your brain has been designed to treat losses as extremely catastrophic. And then there's something I find genuinely fascinating. Neuroscience research has shown that when people think about their future selves, the brain activates many of the same regions associated with thinking about strangers, not yourself, someone else. So when you push a cost onto your future self, you're not really betraying yourself. You're asking a person your brain barely identifies with to pick up the tab. And these are not personal failures, none of these are, but they are predictable outputs of a biological system. So once you see them that way, through that perspective, you stop blaming yourself and start designing smarter systems for your life to revolve around. Now, I want to make this idea clear that emotion is not the enemy of reason. We need both. We truly do. And I think this is especially something that is common in science communities, and it genuinely does harm because we are told to be rational, to move through every decision that we make rationally, to remove emotion from decision making, to think and not feel. And I mean, maybe that sounds correct on the surface, but it's not what the neuroscience says. You cannot just remove emotion. That is pretty much impossible to do because emotion is so deeply ingrained in how our brains are wired. And it's the system that evolved first that you cannot just remove it entirely and let your logic take over everything. Now, there's a well-documented group of patients in the literature for this topic who suffered damage to a specific region of their prefrontal cortex. Their intelligence was completely intact. Their memory, language, and reasoning abilities were normal by every measure, but their ability to make decisions essentially collapsed. Choosing what to eat could take hours. Scheduling a simple appointment became an endless loop of analysis with no resolution. Why? Why was this observed in the literature? Because the damage disconnected them from their emotional responses. They could analyze every option, but there was no signal telling them which option actually mattered the most. And this produced one of the most important ideas in modern neuroscience, that emotions act as a lot of you might know about this through Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Slow and Fast, which is a really good book that I recommend reading to learn more about this. But in this case, I mean, when when you try to guide your decision making through emotions, before your slow, deliberate reasoning even gets involved, it narrows the field, really. It weighs the options differently. It tells you quickly what's worth caring about without giving you time to actually think through every option properly. And that gut feeling is not mystical or irrational. It is pattern recognition that your nervous system has encoded from every similar situation you've ever been in before. It is compressed experience, real pattern recognition, and fear-driven avoidance. The best decisions happen when emotional and cognitive systems are working together, not when one is trying to override the other. So you really know you need both. Don't listen to all the people who say you just need logic and, rationing through every decision. You need both emotion and logic to make the best decisions without one overriding the other. Now let's talk about habits because habits are where real behavioral change lives. It's not in something like motivation, it's not in willpower, it's in the wiring itself. When a behavior gets repeated, consistently in the same context, paired with some kind of reward, your brain eventually begins to start, treating the entire sequence as one unit. At that point, the behavior transfers out of your prefrontal cortex and into the basal ganglia, a deep region inside the kind of the center of your brain that operates largely outside of your conscious awareness. And that is why habits feel almost automatic. At the neural level, they really are automatic if you think about it. And the brain does this because it's efficient. Automating a repeated behavior frees up cognitive resources for things that are actually new and complex. And it has to be efficient because, again, it uses 20% of your energy. But the same mechanism that makes good habits effortless also makes destructive ones incredibly hard to shift. So that's the key to keep in mind. Every time a habit runs, the synaptic pathway associated with it gets physically stronger. And this is long-term potentiation, which you may have heard about if you've read about neuroplasticity, and it's the cellular mechanism that underlies all of learning and memory. So a habit is not just a behavior, it is a structural feature of your brain. And once those synaptic connections are so powerful, it's truly hard to break a habit, as you have probably realized at some point in your life. So willpower, you know, as much as people say willpower is, is just the most powerful thing to break one, I think it's the wrong tool. Because trying to resist a habit at the moment of temptation is a frontal versus subcortical battle that's just happening in your brain. And the subcortex, keep in mind, has years of practice on you. It developed way before the cortex did. So the connections there are a lot more powerful. You won't win on that ground, I'll tell you this. The more powerful move, however, is to target the cue. If the trigger never fires, the routine never starts. Without activation, the pathway weakens over time. And this is why environment design is a more reliable strategy than trying harder. You are not fighting the habits head on. You are just quietly removing the thing that starts it. So take notes, because that's probably the best way they can try to break a habit, a bad habit, of course. Your brain processes potential threats in roughly 12 milliseconds before you're consciously aware of anything. 12 milliseconds is very fast. So you can imagine it's hard for your conscious awareness to keep up. Before your prefrontal cortex has even entered the conversation, the amygdala has already flagged the situation, it's narrowed your attention, and started mobilizing your body toward caution. What's really striking is that uncertainty, just not knowing what's going to happen, activates many of the same neural circuits as an actual physical threat. Ambiguity reads to your brain as something in the neighborhood of danger. This is why people often they prefer a known bad outcome over an uncertain one. Clarity, even painful clarity, lets the threat response resolve. So open-ended unknowing keeps it running. And then there's this chronic stress, um, what chronic stress does to your brain structurally, because it has probably more powerful effects than you imagine. Sustained elevated cortisol causes measurable changes in the prefrontal cortex. Dendrites, the receiving branches of your neurons, physically retract under prolonged stress, under prolonged high levels of cortisol. Your working memory, your executive function, and impulse control are all impaired, not just psychologically, but structurally. So the worst possible time to make an important decision is when you are stressed, when you're exhausted, or when you're emotionally overwhelmed. Your rational brain is running at reduced capacity. Your alarm system is decisions in advance. You're not relying on willpower in a compromised state. You're relying on a decision you already made when you were actually thinking clearly and in a low stress environment. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind again. And if you believe you are a rational, unbiased thinker, most of us do, to be fair, to some degree at least, the neuroscience would respectfully but firmly push back on this, because every human brain carries cognitive biases, systematic, predictable distortions in how we process information. And they are not random. They trace back to specific neural mechanisms. They are features of a brain. Oh, this term, confirmation bias. So seeking out and favoring information that confirms what you already believe. This has a dopaminergic component. That's why it's so powerful. That's why this confirmation bias is such an entirely, you know, powerful thing that can really affect your decision making. Information that validates an existing belief generates a small reward signal, and then information that challenges it generates discomfort. Again, this is again how our brain has been wired. Your brain is literally incentivizing you to stay wrong because being wrong in a new direction feels worse than being consistently wrong in a familiar one. And that's a very interesting thing. And now let's talk about the sunk cost fallacy more. It's essentially loss aversion playing out over time. You keep investing in something, like I said, a project, a relationship, a decision, whatever it is, because of what you've already put in, even when the rational move is to stop. But abandoning it, it feels like confirming a loss, and your brain is wired to treat losses as disproportionately costly. Why? Because again, that's how it has been wired. And that's why, I'm sure all of us here, we hate to lose. And this is part of that because your brain interprets losses twice as costly. Or now the availability heuristic is another very important thing here. It's a memory retrieval effect. Vivid, emotional, recent events are cognitively accessible, so they feel statistically more likely than they actually are. And this is why people dramatically overestimate, dramatic, memorable risks and underestimates quiet, boring, statistically significant ones. These are not character flaws. They're absolutely not. They are, therefore, is not whether you have them, because you do, I do, everyone does. The question is whether you have enough awareness to catch them in action. So that's a question to ask yourself and reflect on. Now, neuroplasticity, I'm sure if you're a neuroscience geek, it's probably one of your favorite topics, and we're going to cover it a bit here. Everything I've said so far could sound like a case for giving up. Your brain is biased. Your habits run on all the brain that we have? Absolutely not. And this is the part of the talk that I want you to take with you the most. The most important thing neuroscience has established in the last few decades is that the brain is plastic. It's not fixed, not hardwired, into changing in response to what that fire together, wire together. These are enough times and the pathway deepens. You are actively sculpting your brain through your behavior, whether you intend to or not. And quality sleep and meaningful social connection, as well as things like reduced chronic stress. In neuroscience, all of it requires sustained intention. For decision making specifically, this means something concrete. Every time you pause before a reactive decision, you are strengthening the circuitry of thought. Every time you catch a bias and correct it, you are building a skill, an extremely useful skill. Everything that you do, and every time you override an impulsive choice with an intentional one, instead of reacting to something without, every time you do this, emotionally charged, I mean, exactly the way that a muscle does when you hit the gym, let's say. So the brain you have today is not the one that you have to keep. It's constantly changing. It changes every day. More capable. Let's make this practical. A lot of this talk has been about the science and, just a few tips here and there, but I want to give you some really practical tips because understanding the without is just expensive. I want to say useless trivia. So I want to give you four tools. They're all grounded in research and are all usable today for anyone. The first one is a vague vocal goal, like I'll focus more or I'll be more disciplined. You form a specific if-then plan. If it's a Tuesday morning and I've had coffee, I will open my work before I open any social media. This works because doing the decision making in advance under calm conditions, again, not stressful, rather than in the moments when you're tired or distracted or being pulled toward something easier. You preload the cue routine link before the willpower test even shows up. The second is temporal distancing. When you're facing an emotionally charged decision, project forward and ask yourself, how will I reveal different? Meanwhile, often deflates urgency that often that feels enormous, but it actually isn't. It's not as deep as you think it is. The third is environment design, and I genuinely think this is the most underrated tool on this list because it requires zero willpower. Your behavior follows your environment. Better put it in a different room. Put the thing you want to do first in the place where you'll see it first. You're, by doing this, you're reshaping the cues your brain encounters, which reshapes the behaviors that follows. You're not fighting your defaults, you're changing them. And the fourth and last one is the metacognitive pause. So metacognition, as you may know, it's thinking about your thinking, which is incredibly powerful. It's very philosophical at the same time. So before any significant reactive decision, wait 10 seconds. It sounds simple because it really is. But neurologically, um, even a brief pause gives your prefrontal cortex a window to partially reassert itself over the limbic response. It interrupts the automatic. Practice consistently, it builds the habits of noticing what your brain is doing, being the observer, not just a passenger. So just let that slide first. Let that, sink in for a sec. Think about your thinking and you can observe what your own brain is doing. Being able to do that, it's not a very easy skill, but it can easily be honed over time by practicing it consistently. Because if you can think about your thoughts, why you think what you think, how you think what you think, like what drives your thoughts in different situations, when you notice what your brain is doing, that can help you make a lot more informed, more powerful decisions and can help you get to know yourself better as a person and the kind of things that you want to prioritize in your life. Now, I want to close with something that I keep coming back to. We treat neuroscience like it's a field that studies other people only, like we're looking at brains behind glass. But everything we've covered together today is about you. It's about your dopamine, your amygdala, your habits, your biases, your plasticity. This is not abstract. This is you. It's about you. You are not separate from your brain. You are your brain, and your brain is essentially you. And also, somehow, it's the thing that can observe it. That strange, unresolved paradox sits right at the center of consciousness. And I think it's worth sitting with rather than, rushing past and ignoring it. Now, here's what I know. Understanding your brain does not diminish your agency, it expands it. So when you know your prefrontal cortex is compromised by stress, you protect your decision making by protecting your sleep. When you know that present bias is wiring you to betray your future self, you design systems that compensate for it before the moment of temptation. When you know that confirmation bias is slowly closing your mind, you can practice holding your beliefs a little more closely, um, more loosely, I should say, actually. And every decision that you make is a vote for the kind of brain that you're building. Repetition wires, attention shapes, environment sculpts. You are both the architect and the architecture at the same time. And that is such a powerful thing to realize. I started by asking myself how many of our 35,000 daily decisions are actually mine. And I did this because I believe the more you understand about the brain, about your own brain, the more of it you can be. Um, and essentially, the better you understand the way that you think, the better decisions you can make that can inform different areas of your life a lot better and in a way that will make you more successful in the future, make you more informed of how to react and what sort of choices to make under pressure in different situations in life. And again, this is a skill that has to be practiced over and over. But thanks to how plastic your brain is, it's not as hard as you think. If anything today sparked a question in your minds, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, thank you all. Gracias a todos. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Yes, Tirsa, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's an interesting topic because I love the that you say about the decisions, and I want to say, do you think you could give us some recommendations or how to pursue or find opportunities in neuroscience, especially when we are young, or how did you get into neuroscience or something like that?
Yeah, can you repeat the first part of your question?
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Do
No,
you
no
think
worries.
Yes, sorry. Do you
No worries.
think you could give us some recommendations or on how to pursue or find opportunities in neuroscience, especially when we are young? Or how did you get in neuroscience?
That's a great question. How I got into neuroscience personally, I mean, how I got interested in it was I was in high school. I took a biology class. And one of the topics, one of the units that we had was about neuroscience. And honestly, I didn't think, like, I knew I wanted to do something in science, but I didn't think neuroscience was my kind of thing. But then after, taking that unit, a lot of the lessons and, learning a lot about neurons and the brain and the nervous system, I was so incredibly fascinated that I started to think, I mean, while it is incredibly hard and complex, it's a very, very complicated field, and it takes a lot of mental gymnastics to understand every sort of concept in neuroscience. Um, I thought, I mean, this is it's just such a open field in the sense that there's so much yet to discover. And I'm very big on research. I love doing research. And I knew that in a field like neuroscience, there's a lot of research that I'll be able to do. So that's kind of what sparked my interest in it um, from high school, and then why I applied for neuroscience programs going into university. And I think for young people, if you're in high school or early undergraduates, like university even, the best ways to pursue opportunities would be through your university if you're already in university. Look for competitions, perhaps something like Brain Bee, like what we're doing now, um, and talk to, people in the field, researchers at your university who are in the field, because as far as I know, like every university probably has some kind of neuroscience department or something similar. And they can, share a lot of opportunities that you can get involved in, both research, getting into labs, internships, um, even potentially startups to work for. And also they can offer mentorship from older students in higher years who can teach you a lot about neuroscience and how to perform research in neuroscience. And if you're in high school, I mean, if you're not in university yet, you can try to look for a local university and try to find a lot of opportunities through there. I think that's the best place if you're trying to look for something more locally. And as a lot of opportunities in neuroscience are, I want to say, reserved for higher level students. But even if you're in high school, I'm sure there can be some kind of maybe mentorship program you can get involved in. And other than that, if you want to connect with more youth in neuroscience, you can join organizations. Like I run an organization, Youth STEM Initiative, and there are a lot of people interested in neuroscience in the organization. So you can connect with a lot of fellow neuroscience enthusiasts. Most of them are in high school, and a lot of them share opportunities and resources that they've used and worked with before. So it's all about, making connections with different people, opportunities, whether again you're in high school or university, it doesn't matter.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, no
Yeah,
worries.
thanks.
Are there any other doubts or questions or comments that you want to give to Amreli? He's very smart and he has a lot of expertise, so don't be shy. You can also put it in the chat if there's anything.
Yeah, don't be shy.
He's a very
Ask
nice
anything you want.
guy.
I can also put my email or LinkedIn, whatever.
Yes, if you could put your email on the chat, that would be great. And so that kids can, just shoot you an email if there's any doubts or anything that they want to ask.
I just shared my LinkedIn and email if you have any questions about anything. Otherwise, you can ask now.
I'm also going to share it with the kids on the chats in case someone couldn't. If you have Well, if there aren't any other doubts or anything, I think you guys are free to go.
Okay, yeah. If you have any other questions, if it popped up later in your mind, just send it to my email or connect on LinkedIn, message me, whatever. I'm open to answering any of them.
Thank you so much, Amarali, and thank you so much for
Thank you
being
so much.
here and for your time and for all this incredible knowledge. And
Of
I,
course.
I
A
really
pleasure.
love that the kids interacted with you and that they were able to ask you questions.
My pleasure. My pleasure to talk to you today. And thank you, Carol, for inviting me to this. I hope to do it again soon.
Yes, we would love to have you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think creo que ya se pueden ir, chicos. Ya no los detendré más tiempo.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Have a good one. Buenas noches.
Muy buen español, Amiral.
Gracias, gracias. Adiós.
Nos vemos, Amiral, y muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.